mattina io sono andato alla Sistina a votare tranquillamente. Mai avrei immaginato quello che stava per succedere.
But it wasn't much I couldn't feel, so I tried to touch. I told the truth, I didn't come to fool you. And even though it all went wrong, I stand before the Lord of Sun with nothing on my tongue but hallelujah. Hallelujah, hallelujah,
Welcome to In Pursuit of Truth. This is your host, Sir Patrick Mack. We're back once again, and we're picking up where we left off in our last video. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of the musical selections at the RNC and what it might mean for you and me. We're also going to talk a little bit about Godfather 3 and what it might have to do with the Vatican City. So won't you fist bump your neighbor and come with me as you grab your coffee and stretch those hammies? Let's go.
Gonna get pursued. Gonna get pursued.
First things first, I want to take you back to a few of my older videos so that you can have a little base understanding for what we're talking about today. Starting off with my last video entitled Turandot. This is a reference to the opera Turandot, featuring the aria Nessun Dorma, No One Sleeps. This is the aria that Christopher Macchio, the tenor, performed at the RNC recently. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the RNC, but I highly suggest you check out that video first. And then I also want to take you back to the origin of this series here, Cardinal Sins, starting off with Cardinal Sins 1 from back on October 7, 2019, followed up by Cardinal Sins 2 on October 12. Now, there's a lot of information being covered in this. We're talking about a raid that was conducted on the Vatican City, and we're talking a lot about the upper echelons of the Vatican, the Holy See, the Catholic Church, and how this structure works, how it is related to a lot of the events that are going on today, and possibly the music choices that were selected at the RNC. So I don't want to go into all of it because we put a lot of it into that video. Please check that out. But that's where we are starting, and now we are moving you forward to the RNC, which was in the near past. So we're not moving you that far forward because we're actually kind of moving you back, I guess, aren't we? Well, we talked about Nessun Dorma, we talked a little bit about the Ave Maria, and I want to talk about another song selection that ruffled a few feathers, and that was the song Hallelujah. This is a song by Canadian singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen, now deceased, who recorded it in 1983 and released it on his Various Positions album in 1984. This song actually wasn't that popular for quite some years until some other recording artists started to cover it and people started to rediscover this tune. In particular, Rufus Wainwright, and of course probably the most famous version at this point by now deceased recording artist Jeff Buckley. We've seen this in a number of TV shows, films, and whatnot. I'm sure you remember this song and you've heard it at some point. Really popular song, and for good reason. But this is not necessarily a gospel song, and I do want to talk a little bit about the meaning of this song because I do think it's relevant. But like I said, ruffled some feathers, including the estate of Leonard Cohen himself. This is from CBS News. Leonard Cohen estate rebukes Trump's unauthorized use of Hallelujah at RNC. And they made a very pointed comment of which we're going to refer to in just a moment. But this obviously upset them for the use. The Trump administration played it not only once, but followed it up after the fireworks display with a live performance of it by Christopher Macchio, of which you just saw. So this suggests to me that, like the other two songs we discussed in my previous video, Turandot, Hallelujah might have some relevance, and we're going to explore a lot of options in this video, which will lead us into our next topic. But Hallelujah has a couple of interesting things about it that I'd like to share with you. Some of it may be trivial, some of it may not be, but it's written in the key of C major. I'll explain why that may or may not be relevant later, but it's also, interestingly enough, in what we call 12/8 time. And if you're not familiar with music theory, it means that you would count the song like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Just like that. So it's got that old school gospel triplet kind of swinging back and forth feel that Cohen was going for, although this song was far from a gospel song. Anything but. This was actually a breakup song. Cohen wrote around 80 verses of this song. The original recording used about 7 of them. And throughout his career, he would sort of mix and match, but usually he would start off with the same first verse and then kind of embellish from there. And that's what I want to talk about. There were a couple of particular verses selected for Macchio's performance, and I want to start off with verse 1, which is right here. Now that I've heard there was a secret chord that David played and it pleased the Lord. But you don't really care for music, do you? It goes like this: the fourth, the fifth, the minor fall, the major lift, the baffled king composing Hallelujah. So let's break that down just a little bit. First of all, starting off with, who is this David? Well, that would be a reference to King David, which is later referenced again by Cohen in the same song. King David, known in the Hebrew Bible as the third king of Israel. And he's also known in the book of Samuel as the young shepherd who slays the giant Goliath. He later goes on to soothe King Saul with his sweet, sweet music, almost like he knows about the tone that pleases the Lord, right? And of course, eventually is anointed king, conquers Jerusalem, but because he commits adultery with Bathsheba, which is mentioned in the Cohen song, God decides that he is not going to allow David the opportunity to build the temple in Jerusalem. This goes to his son Solomon. Well, David was unable to build the temple in Jerusalem, but perhaps this is a nod to Trump's moving the embassy to Jerusalem himself. So whether or not the stories of President Trump and King David are relevant to each other is not for me to decide. As always, that is up to you. But I will point out that there were many in Israel who believed that to be the very case. As a matter of fact, President Trump caught some heat a few years back by retweeting some of that praise. But in 2016, Mark Zell, who's chairman of Republicans Overseas Israel, organized an event out there at the Neville David, which is a catering hall, Neville David being the harp of David. Remember, he was a musician, right? And this is overlooking the Temple Mount. I guess it was a little bit more of a difficult place to arrange, but that's where they wanted to put this. Now, what I found interesting about this story is that Zell at the time did not realize he was organizing the event at the actual burial site of King David. That is largely known to be the Kever David, which is a small distance away. There are others that would compare President Trump to the Persian King Cyrus, who, like David and President Trump, were all considered unlikely characters, not originally known as godly men, right? Well, those are the comparisons, and we're not talking about Cyrus today, but that is the reference, and that's a very long-winded explanation as to who David is in this song. Well, David played, and it pleased the Lord. So is there really such a thing as a secret chord? Well, it's hard to say, but I do think we know that certain vibrations have scientific application, right? Is this a reference to this, or was David just simply a sweet harp player? Well, who knows, but you don't really care about music, do you? It goes like this: the fourth, the fifth, the minor fall, the major lift. So we're talking about intervals here, the perfect fourth and the major fifth. Now, just below the major fifth is what is known as a diminished fifth, or in this case, in the key of C, an augmented fourth, or tritone, long known to be the devil's tone. This was actually banned for a long time. It wasn't really until after the Renaissance period that you started hearing it at all. And nowadays you hear it in all kinds of modern metal music and whatnot. But for a long time, this was known as the devil's tone. And this is essentially 6 semitones. Now, we're not going to get too deep into the music theory of it all, but in the key of C major, which is what the song Hallelujah is in, the tritone would exist between F and B. The minor fall, the major lift, kind of like a V, or what President Trump likes to call Super V, which I'm not a fan. Sorry, I'm not a fan of that one. Super V. It's a V. I don't know about the Super V. Super V's pushed it. The baffled king composing Hallelujah. So there you have it. I imagine if there is a devil's tone, then there must also be a secret chord that pleases the Lord. Is that what the Trump admin is referring to? Well, I'd say it's a bit of a stretch, but pretty curious considering the fact that President Trump's uncle, John Trump, nuclear scientist, was tasked by the FBI to review the notes of one Nikola Tesla. So I guess if anybody would know, he would, right? It goes like this: the 4th, the 5th. That's a 4 and a 5. 45. President Trump is also a 45, 45th president of the United States. So maybe this is just simply telling us that he's going through a minor fall, but is about to come back with a major lift. But there is verse 1. Now, like I said, many musicians will open up with that first verse and then go into whatever verse of choice that they may have. They've got 80 to choose from, 7, I guess, if you're just looking at the recording. However, this particular performance chose verse 4. I'm not sure if it was Macho himself who chose it, or maybe it was President Trump or part of the team who chose it. But either way, they decided to perform verse 4. I did my best. It wasn't much. I couldn't feel, so I tried to touch. I've told the truth. I didn't come to fool you. And even though it all went wrong, I'll stand before the Lord of Song with nothing on my tongue but hallelujah. So you can see there's kind of a somber tone with all of this. This is a really gruesome breakup. The dude wrote 80 verses about this. Like I said, this is definitely not a gospel song, but there's a lot of depth to this, and I found it very interesting that President Trump chose to use this one. So is it possible that President Trump is simply offering up this song as a breakup song? Are we breaking up with somebody? Is the left and right going to go their separate ways? Is this going to become a civil war? Well, I think it's a little early to tell, but it does look like there's a lot of signs suggesting that there is some sort of breakup happening. Now, I also mentioned that the estate of Leonard Cohen had something to say about this. As a matter of fact, they are pursuing legal action. This is from the Daily Beast. In a subtle the estate added, had the RNC requested another song, You Want It Darker, for which Leonard won a posthumous Grammy in 2017. I know. We might have considered approval of that song. Okay, so they think this is a sick burn. They think that conservatives don't understand that this isn't a gospel song. They think that it's really ironic that we're using this breakup song, and they're probably not realizing that they're being trolled themselves. Or at least that's the way that I would look at it. But this song, You Want It Darker, is also curious, and I find it worth mentioning that we at least take a quick look. Considering the Trump administration is dealing with copyright issues, I most certainly am not going to want to push my luck with this song. But if you've not heard this tune, You Want It Darker, I do suggest at least checking it out once. It's a dark tune, sort of deals with the paradox of the finite and the infinite, if you will. That's very much Leonard Cohen, but this is indeed a dark tune, and it was released on October 21st, 2016 by Columbia Records, and this was just 19 days before Cohen passed away. And very much like the Johnny Cash album that he released before his death, it had a very same kind of somber theme. But we're going to take a look at verses 1 and 4 again. Verse 1, if you are the dealer, I'm out of the game. If you are the healer, I'm broken and lame. If thine is the glory, then mine must be the shame. You want it darker, we kill the flame. So it kind of gives you the idea of this whole dichotomy of good and evil and how you can't really have a healer unless you have the sick, so on and so forth. I'm not going to get all up in that. But I want to take you over to verse 4. They're lining up the prisoners. The guards are taking aim. I struggled with some demons. They were middle class and tame. Didn't know I had permission to murder and to maim. You want it darker. And then the refrain is this, Hineni, Hineni, I'm ready, my lord, which basically means I am here. I am ready. So this was interesting stuff. And there was no actual official music video released for this. But if you listen to it, you'll see how dark it really, really is. And considering that this was released in 2016, it's odd timing. As a matter of fact, he died right before the election. Now you might say, IPOT, When you say right before, do you mean like a couple of weeks, few days? What are you talking about? He died the day before the 2016 election. And speaking of the 2016 election, I can't help but think that this was yet another expert troll job by the Trump administration. Keep in mind, I told you that this was played not once, but twice, which suggests to me that they knew this was coming and they were doubling down on this. But the first time was played during the fireworks, and this was a recording by the artist Tori Kelly, who received a ton of flack on Twitter, and rightfully so. She stayed out of it. She didn't bother to trash Trump. She just kind of stayed out of it. Can't say I blame her. It's Twitter. Sometimes you take a beating. Sometimes you give one. But the second time was the live performance by Christopher Macchio. And like I said, he sang verses 1 and 4. Well, this was very likely a troll job of the night of the 2016 election, when Hillary Clinton was supposed to have won the whole darn thing. And it didn't turn out that way. Well, on Saturday Night Live, a very famous anti-Trump platform, they had Kate McKinnon posing as Hillary Clinton, and she actually sat at the piano and sang this song. So was there a deeper rooted meaning to all this, or was this simply a snub to the Clinton cabal, reminding her that once again in 2020 she's not going to be president either? Well, either way, as always, you decide. But I will say this, whatever it was, I can't help but think that the Trump administration had to have seen it coming. They've dealt with this with Neil Young, most recently Linkin Park, but they've had a number of artists complain about copyright issues. So I can't help but think that they didn't see it coming and not only decided to go through with it, but decided to double down, which suggests to me that they were sending a clear message. But now I want to take you back to the aria Nessun Dorma from Turandot. And if you'll remember, this is about Calaf, who wants to marry Turandot, and he has to pass her 3 tests, which he does. She moves the goalposts on him, and so he decides that he's going to issue her a challenge and says, if you can discover my name by morning, you can kill me. But if not, I get to marry you, which seems like a raw deal to me, but that's the deal that he made. But that's what this tune is all about. Nessun dorma. No one sleeps. She's putting out all her resources to make sure that they find out who this guy is overnight. And it kind of is parallel to another certain entity that we're familiar with, in which the media is constantly talking about, especially lately. They're trying to discredit this particular entity, except for the fact that they're not asking the most important question, which is simply, who is it? So here's a little bit of the lyrics translated. No one sleeps, no one sleeps. Even you, O princess, in your cold room, look at the stars that tremble with love and with hope. But my mystery is locked inside me. No one will know my name. No, no. On your mouth, I will say it when the light shines. And as you can see here, this is from genius.com. This refers to the people of Peking in the show are singing, no one will know his name, and we, alas, will have to die. Well, we know now that Peking is now known as China, right? But at the end, Calaf ends with the big ending. Disappear night, fade away stars at dawn. And then, of course, it's the Vincerò, Vincerò. I will win. I will win. I will win. 3 times. And what's interesting is that Christopher Macchio decided to add a 4th in his performance. Maybe he wasn't tired of the winning. Trump was like, hey, Chris, are you tired of the winning? And Chris is like, no, I want 4 win. You know, I want 4 winning. Now I want to take you back to another one of these selections from the RNC, and that was the intermezzo from the Cavalleria Rusticana, which was something that was being performed in the Godfather 3, and that was the connection we were making in the video. Go back and check that if you have not seen it already. Well, those guys have mentioned the movie Godfather 3 a number of times, and that's what I want to talk about now. Most recently, this post 3565 from the 31st of July 2019, and this was referencing a link that took you to the Twitter of Pope Francis, who said this: "Let us pray that the Lord will free the victims of human trafficking and help us to respond actively to the cry for help of so many of our brothers and sisters who are deprived of their dignity and freedom." And then, of course, those guys say Godfather 3, it's going to be biblical. And so we kind of mentioned how the scene that was being staged outside the RNC was very reminiscent of the opera scene from the ending of Godfather 3. Well, oddly enough, the very next day, Francis Ford Coppola announces that they are going to be releasing a new version of Godfather Part 3. This is from Vanity Fair. When it comes to films, director Francis Ford Coppola is perhaps always ready to be pulled back in. On the heels of his acclaimed restorations of Apocalypse Now and The Cotton Club, the Oscar-winning filmmaker has next set his sights on the notorious and disappointing finale to the Godfather trilogy. As announced by Paramount on Thursday, Coppola has finally completed a long-discussed new edit of The Godfather Part 3, just in time for the film's 30th anniversary. So the project is going to be called Mario Puzo's The Godfather Coda, The Death of Michael Corleone. This is a pretty long title, but that's going to actually be playing in theaters, and it might have a really good chance considering how few films are being played in theaters, which is slowly reopening right now. And although I gotta say the timing of this announcement was very curious, it was a long time coming. Coppola's been wanting to do this for a long time, really ever since he released it. If you are not familiar with the original release, it was a bit of a disappointment after such a huge success of the first two films. But here's his statement: The Godfather Coda, The Death of Michael Corleone, is an acknowledgement of Mario's and my preferred title and our original intentions for what became The Godfather Part 3, Coppola said in a statement. For this version of the finale, I created a new beginning and ending and rearranged some scenes, shots, and music cues. With these changes and the restored footage and sound, to me, it is a more appropriate conclusion to The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2, and I'm thankful to Jim Giannopoulos and Paramount for allowing me to revisit it. Okay, so really curious timing, and I want to talk a little bit about the original plot of the story. If you're not familiar with the plot of Godfather 3, this is a great movie in terms of context to what we're seeing in the world today. And actually, at the time of its release, it was a very similar thing. History tends to repeat itself. Those guys have referenced this movie a number of times, likely for a reason, as well as these other movies. And it's not because they're great movies, it's because they're giving us insight as to what we're seeing in the world today. Godfather 3 is no different. And throughout this entire saga, we chronicle the life of the Corleone family, but in particular, Michael Corleone, who is played expertly by Al Pacino. And you even see him sort of grow up through the entire saga. And at the time of the third film, Michael Corleone is a lot older and he's trying to push the family into a more legitimate realm of doing business. And we see this in the opening scene where he's actually at St. Patrick's Cathedral and he donated $100 million to the Roman Catholic Church. He's being honored with the Order of St. Sebastian. And it's just a few scenes later, early in the movie, that we actually get the gist of the movie, when Michael Corleone is offering to deposit $500 million into the Vatican Bank. And he is speaking to the Archbishop at the time. And he says something very curious, saying that the power to absolve debt is more difficult than the power to forgive. And this is where we see sort of a dark turn with the church. We already kind of suspect it, but we actually sort of see it coming out of the Archbishop's mouth. We see the way that he speaks and sort of the mafia gangster-like way that they can actually be. And this is where he looks at Corleone and demands $600 million. Now, keep in mind, we've just spent 2 movies seeing what a tough guy Corleone is. And so to see this coming out of the Archbishop's mouth, it really shows where the Vatican stands with all of this. And very similar to what we're seeing right now, the reason for this is because they're trying to cover a $700 million deficit. So essentially asking for all of it from the Corleone family. Now, what's also important about this story is that Corleone is asking to take over an international immobiliare. So we're talking about international real estate, and that's also very relevant. We'll talk about the real estate in just a moment, but I want to get to the origins and the motivations of these deals, which is the debt itself. Very much like the scenes I just described, the Vatican is dealing with some money issues themselves. Now, that may seem surprising to you considering they have squillions of dollars, right? But they are. Number one, the Rona, which I don't have, by the way. No offense if you do, but some people do, and a lot of people aren't going to Vatican City anymore. That's a big cash cow, tourism, right? Well, number two, they also have mounting legal fees due to tons of sexual abuse allegations. And that is a big reason why they were taking some of these deals and moving a lot of money, likely to protect themselves. Now, a big reason for bringing in Cardinal Timothy Dolan was to sort of handle the PR on all of this. And although I don't know where he necessarily stands with all the sexual abuse, he comes off as a conservative, but you never really know. However, I do want to point out that this was the same Cardinal Timothy Dolan that was wrapped up in a $57 million scandal in which they were moving all this money into a cemetery trust fund. So there's a lot going on here, which is why I would encourage you to go back over Cardinal Sins 1 and 2, because a lot of that is base knowledge for what we're talking about here. But this was Cardinal Dolan. Very similar situation to what we see in the opening of this movie. I also tell you about one of his supporters in Cardinal Sins 1, Danielle Bodini. This guy was also wrapped up in the upper echelons of the church. He is mentioned in Jeffrey Epstein's Black Book as well. He is also the owner of the helicopter that flew into the AXA Equitable Center back in summer of 2019. It was not him who died in the crash, it was his pilot, but it was registered to this Danielle Bodini, a big time sponsor of Cardinal Dolan, who had been wrapped up with all this money being pushed into the cemetery fund and is tasked with doing PR work in the wake of all these sexual abuse allegations. Now I want to talk a little bit more about Danielle Bodini. This is somebody who seems to wield a lot of influence, and yet we're not doing any talking about him. Like I said, this was his helicopter, and it appeared to be one of his pilots who was flying alone when he crashed. Incidentally, he crashed at the AXA Equitable Center, which just so happened to be the offices of Sidley Austin LLP, the prolific law firm in which I went through great lengths talking about in my Weatherman series 1, 2, and 3. You can check that out and why it's rather important. All I want to state right now is that there are law firms, I'm not saying it's Sidley Austin, but there are law firms out there who specialize in what I would consider snuff law, essentially blackmail, all kinds of ways of blackmailing you. 6 ways to Sunday, right? And who better to blackmail you than a lawyer? Because if you're going to try and sue them, they're already ready for you. Just putting that in your head. But here is another picture of Danielle Bodini. Now remember, this guy was an ambassador of the Republic of San Marino. He's very influential. He also sat on the Ban Ki-moon Foundation. As a matter of fact, I do believe he still does. He's on the board of trustees. This is a very influential figure. His own wedding was presided over by a cardinal, so I guess you could say he's pretty well hooked up within the upper echelons of the church. Now here he is pictured with an Andrea Piedamonte, and this is at the Guggenheim. This is a fundraiser. So once again, we're talking about art. I also want to point out that Danielle Bodini is a major contributor to the Frick Center, of which I did an entire series on that, almost like I'm from the future. The Frick Center, if you're not aware, is the museum that was directly located across from Jeffrey Epstein's apartment. And if you want to know more about that and how the art trade is connected to human trafficking, please check out my video entitled What the Frick, and it's flashing right there for you. But this guy right here, handsome young lad, his name is Andrea Piedamonte. I wasn't exactly sure who he is, so I went and checked him out. His full name is Andrea Piedamonte Bodini. Interesting indeed. Now, I'm going to assume that this is either a son, an uncle. It's probably right around the same age as being a father or an uncle to Andrea Piedamonte, but I find it incredibly interesting that neither one of these seem to have any kind of media in relation to this helicopter crash. After all, even though Danielle was not in this helicopter, it crashed and killed somebody, and we didn't seem to get any kind of statement. We didn't seem to get any kind of real media attention. After all, this guy is such an influential character, what it seems to be like behind the scenes. And here we have this son who is a rising actor. Well, let's read a little bit about him from his IMDb. How did you get your start? While studying, he began his professional career in film thanks to Woody Allen. Just let that sink in for a second. Who cast him as Natasha Lyonne's love interest in the film Everyone Says I Love You. Okay, well, it gets even weirder, ladies and gentlemen. He also produced a film in 2005 called All the Invisible Children. So we've got another humanitarian right here. But what's interesting about this is that one of the directors on that was Ridley Scott. And that's another director that those guys have mentioned quite frequently. In particular, the movie White Squall, where we get the phrase, where we go one, we go all, right? There's a big storm coming. Well, it looks like Andrea Piedamonte Bodini is doing pretty well. Here he is with Mark Wahlberg shooting all the money in the world. I'd say that's a pretty sweet gig. Now, to be fair, he wasn't the original character cast. That was reserved for Kevin Spacey. Now let's all just take a deep breath and let that sink in. And if you're not familiar with what happened to Kevin Spacey, let's just say rapey. So once again, I want to point out I'm not casting any aspersions on either Andrea Piedamonte Bodini or Danielle D. Bodini, but they both seem to be connected with a lot of familiar characters that all seem to come around to the same thing: fine art, the Catholic Church, Jeffrey Epstein, and human trafficking. Now back to the film Godfather 3. Throughout this movie, Michael Corleone realizes that there is another insidious element within the Vatican, and part of that involves this banker known as Kinzig, Frederick Kinzig, Don Lucchese, Archbishop Gilday himself, and others who are attempting to rip off his foundation as well as the Vatican, and he even tries to warn the incoming Pope, who is Cardinal Lamberto, later becomes Pope John Paul I. Shortly after this warning, the Pope is poisoned by the Archbishop. And of course, this story at the time outraged the public because there were a lot of things going on in real life that was hitting too close to home with this. But number one, there were a lot of people that were very upset that this film was implying that the Vatican had some sort of mafia element at all. And it is important to note, while some of that is true, there are also good elements within the church that are truly trying to reform. And we see this struggle in this movie, as well as events that were going on in real time and right now. But in the movie, as well as real life, the Pope John Paul has a very short-lived term. The real Pope John Paul I only lasted 33 days before passing away. Many suspected that it was a murder. Now, in the movie, the Archbishop poisons the Pope in his tea, but in real life, there was a very similar theory going around. In 1984, a British author by the name of David Yallop wrote a book called In God's Name, an investigation into the murder of Pope John Paul. So right around this time, the Banco Ambrosiano scandal was going on, and John Paul I, very much like in the movie Godfather 3, was seen as this reformer who was probably not going to approve of some of these financial misdealings. While in the book, Yallop contends that there is a secretive group of Masons who have essentially infiltrated the Vatican Bank in particular, but really the Vatican. This group was known as Propaganda Due. And of course, the Vatican Bank was Banco Ambrosiano's main shareholder. It was believed that Pope John Paul I was going to help reform the Vatican financial dealings, and that may have been why he was murdered, although the official cause of death was not a murder. Now, Yallop contends that the chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, whose name is Roberto Calvi, was the one who was responsible for the death of Pope John Paul I. Calvi himself was found dead in London in 1982, and they suspected that that death was a murder. And in that investigation, two men were arrested, Licio Gelli and Giuseppe Callo. Both were Propaganda Due. As a matter of fact, Gelli was the headmaster. About a year ago, a man by the name of Anthony Raimondi stepped forward and claimed that he was part of the killing of John Paul I in 1978 by way of cyanide poisoning. And a lot of this had to do with the fact that John Paul I was planning on exposing a lot of these scams. Now, part of this scam involved Coca-Cola, Sunoco. They were essentially selling fake stock certificates to American companies. Well, this would have seemed like a pretty outlandish claim, except for the fact that Anthony Raimondi was part of the Colombo Mafia. More specifically, he was the nephew of Charles Lucky Luciano, and Raimondi claims that it was his cousin Paul Marcinkus who was the one who recruited him. Paul Marcinkus, was an archbishop who died in 2006, but from 1971 to 1989, he was president of the Vatican Bank during the time of the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano. Now, the Vatican looked out for Marcinkus, and Italian authorities were unable to indict him. But Raimondi goes on to claim that his job was to learn the daily habits of the Pope so that Marcinkus would be able to spike his nightly cup of tea with Valium. Once he was asleep, then Marcinkus would prepare a dose of cyanide for him and give it to him by way of a dropper as he slept. This would be so the Pope would not experience any pain and hopefully give these murderers a break in the afterlife. Now, a Vatican doctor would go on to rule that John Paul had suffered a heart attack, and I think there were a lot of people that disputed that fact, but that was the official story. As Yallop explains in his book, In God's Name, the Vatican was set on having the body embalmed right away and didn't seem to want to complete a full autopsy. After that would be the first Polish Pope, John Paul II, who was also intent on exposing some of these financial misdeeds. And according to Raimondi, after seeing what happened the first time, he decided to keep his mouth shut and went on to have the second longest reign in modern history. He died in 2005. And during this time, Raimondi claims that there was a ton of lawlessness going around in the Vatican City. As a matter of fact, he said he would party there often with the cardinals who were wearing civilian clothes, having girls over. And Raimondi even said himself, quote, "If I had to live the rest of my life in Vatican City, it would have been okay with me. It was some setup. My cousins all drove Cadillacs. I'm in the wrong business, I thought. I should have become a cardinal." The Immobiliare being referenced is the Società Generale Immobiliare, or the SGI, which has been around for quite some time, since 1862, once the largest real estate and construction company in Italy. And like I mentioned previously, SGI's largest shareholder was formerly the Vatican, which had 15% of the shares. However, most of the Vatican's holdings in the company were sold during the late 1960s to the Gulf and Western Corporation. In 1966, started to acquire Paramount Pictures. Paramount Pictures made the Godfather film series. All coincidental. At the time of the 1990 release of Godfather 3, the group Opus Dei would be in control of SGI. They are largely considered a right-leaning group, but they have members on both sides of the political aisle. They also have a lot of criticism for being what's referred to a white form of Freemasonry. They don't publish membership lists, and they don't reveal a lot about their finances. John Paul II was a big supporter of Opus Dei, and in 2002 canonized the leader Jose Maria Escrivá. One of those alleged members is Theodore Edgar McCarrick, who is a former cardinal and bishop. John Paul II appointed him to Archbishop of Washington, D.C., so right there in the middle of the swamp. And later on in 2001, John Paul made him a cardinal. Now, what was so controversial about this is that he was rising in the ranks despite numerous sexual abuse allegations. And this was spanning a number of years involving minors all the way up to adults, in particular male adults. But he was dismissed from the clergy in February of 2019, and this was because of a large outcry from the church themselves. They were demanding that he be dealt with. And the reason why it was so important is because he is the most senior church official in modern times to be what they call laicized, which is a formal removal. McCarrick was found guilty by the church by their own investigation, and as recently as December 2019, the Washington Post reported that McCarrick had given over $500,000 to a number of people to hush a lot of these abuse crimes up, including 2 popes, multiple priests, cardinals, bishops, archbishops, all in all more than 100 recipients. And keep in mind, McCarrick had a lot of influence. That's likely why he was rising up the ranks so fast, despite them knowing about all these allegations. But he had also been stationed in D.C. for 5 years, which is a very influential place, and he was rubbing elbows with a lot of influential people. But this wasn't just about inappropriate behavior with male adults. Like I said, this involved minors, and they were saying that he was actually running a sex ring out of his New Jersey home.
wrong.
But even though this was a massive issue for the Vatican, considering the stature of McCain, there were a number of other issues that the Vatican was having to deal with. In May of 2017, Vatican police raided the apartment of Monsignor Luigi Capozzi, who was having what they described as a cocaine-fueled homosexual orgy. And it appears that he wasn't really punished at all, but at that same time, two even higher profile cases were happening. Monsignor Carlo Alberto Capella was found with child pornography on his cell phone and trying to distribute it, as well as Monsignor Pietro Amenta, who also had pornographic images on his phone but had attempted to molest an 18-year-old man. Then you had the removal of 5 bishops in Chile, which Pope Francis didn't originally want to acknowledge but later had to when it became so overwhelming. Honduras was next, and then of course Ireland next. And you can start to see why they would want to keep so much money stashed away for rainy day legal fees. Now, one of the people that was actively and publicly calling out McCain, as well as a number of what he calls the gay mafia that's been injected into the Vatican, was Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano, who recently wrote a letter to President Trump thanking him for all his actions. And in this letter, he refers to one of the many media attacks on President Trump after he visited the National Shrine of St. John Paul II. Now, interestingly enough, it is Vigano who has criticized John Paul II, saying that he was largely the reason why the gay mafia was installed. Remember, McCain was a John Paul II guy. So we start to see the possible connections between Opus Dei and this sexual abuse. Although it is not clear-cut, it is suggested, and that is largely what Vigano is suggesting. He goes on talking about, quote, the Masonic ideals of those who want to dominate the world by driving God out of the courts, out of schools, out of families, and perhaps even out of churches. And you can see this reference in the post from those guys on post 4429. But Archbishop Vigano has also been outspoken on an extremely important topic, that which is the topic of China and their involvement with the Vatican. I want to share with you an excerpt from the outlet From Rome. This is an interview with Marco Tossati, and he is asking Archbishop Vigano about this report in regard to whether or not China had an influence on the very strange resignation of Pope Benedict XVI, and whether or not this would actually even be registered as valid. Tossati asks if in the end the report that everyone is waiting for will be published. Vigano responds, if it is possible to shed light on this affair, this will happen despite the Vatican. The interests at stake are enormous and directly affect the very top of the church, and not only for questions of a doctrinal, moral, or canonical nature, but also for political and diplomatic aspects that have seen the Holy See become the object of a coup d'etat, with the complicity of those who should have defended it in its sovereignty and independence. What did not succeed during the pontificate of Benedict XVI was brought to fruition after his resignation. How can we hope that the one who is indebted for his own election to McCain, who was one of the main proponents of the secret agreement with China, will be able to clarify a series of events that involve him personally, demonstrating the connivances with the Chinese dictatorship against Catholics, faithful to the Holy See, and perhaps also the responsibility of that regime for the resignation of Pope Benedict? How can we imagine that the murky events of St. Gallen will become clear when it was there that the conspirators organized the election of Bergoglio? And how can we believe that the church will purify herself of the corruption and vice of her clerics and prelates when they are the ones who have taken power and who are promoted to the highest levels in a web of complicity between heretics, perverts, and traitors? The one who ought to investigate the scandals is heavily involved in the appointment, promotion, and protection of those who are guilty. Bergoglio has surrounded himself with compromised and thus blackmailed personalities whom he has no qualms about getting rid of as soon as they risk compromising him in his media image. Let's not forget that the legitimization of homosexuality is part of the agenda of the New World Order, to which the Bergoglian Church adheres openly and unconditionally, not only for its destabilizing value in the social body, but also because sodomy is the principal instrument with which the enemy intends to destroy the Catholic priesthood, corrupting the souls of the ministers of God. For this reason, at least as far as what seems possible, the entire truth about McCain will never officially come to light.
The Vatican suspends 5 employees after a raid on the General Affairs offices in the Secretary of State. On Tuesday, Vatican prosecutors seized documents and electronic devices. It was done in connection to an ongoing investigation of the so-called Vatican Bank and Auditor General's office about past financial operations.
If you remember back in part 1 of this series, we were talking about a raid in October of last year by the Vatican police on one of the departments in the Vatican responsible for the purchase of a building area in London. This was residential and commercial, and it was in a very expensive area in London and raised a lot of eyebrows. Well, since then, we've had a couple more raids in February as well as June, but I want to take you back to that original raid. Have a listen to EWTN's Edward Pinton discussing the October raid.
Yes, well, there was a raid on Tuesday, Wyatt. The Vatican police raided the offices of the Secretariat of State and the offices of the Financial Information Authority, which actually monitors or safeguards the Vatican from money laundering. They raided those offices because of what Italian media have reported have been botched property deals, particularly one in London, mounting to possibly 160 million euros. So that was the reason for the raid, and it led to the suspension of 5 staff in the Vatican, the number 2 of the Financial Information Authority, and a Monsignor as well. So that's but also four lay people and a priest. So that's what happened this week.
What does all that, the raids, the financial information itself, what does all that tell us about the alleged corruption within the Roman Curia? I mean, how extensive is this?
Well, it does seem to be very extensive, and the fact that also on Thursday we heard that the Vatican has appointed a new chief prosecutor, if you like, the chief of the Vatican Criminal Tribunal, who's actually a leading anti-mafia magistrate in Italy. He's retired now, but he's had a good reputation of dealing with cases of mafia, and so he's been brought in, which I think underlines the problems that they're having to face here. But also, it's been called a judicial tsunami this week. People have been, reports rather, have been saying how serious it is, and also it follows the prosecution last year of a former president of the Vatican Bank. But all of this, we're told, is just a skimming of the surface, and there's a lot more to be done about cleaning up corruption, financial corruption in the Vatican. I put out a report earlier in July which talked about a whole different department, which hasn't been the focus of these latest raids, which is the department in the Vatican that deals with real estate. And there's various problems there, and reports that I've found out that similar corruptions regarding also London real estate related to that department. So that also needs to be handled. So there's a lot more to be done. But as I say, they are making some progress with this. But I think we're just going to have to see how far this goes and whether these other issues, these other allegations are dealt with as well.
So we see yet again more clear implications that there is a mafia element to all of this. That anti-mafia magistrate referenced is Dr. Giuseppe Pignatone, who is a former prosecutor from Rome. Now understand that the Pope himself owns 177 million acres of land worldwide. It would really be hard to estimate how much the Vatican truly owns because so many of these deals are shady deals. And although the Vatican has access to a ton of assets, real estate is always a good idea. You can sell this off and it can serve a few purposes for you. Number one being the obvious quick cash grab, but if indeed any of this mass abuse occurred on these properties, selling these off might diffuse the story a little bit. But many of these are very posh properties that have been acquired over the years, and there's been a lot of shady dealings, particularly in the people that buy them, generally because many of them are either complicit, aware, or simply don't care. And one of those men was one Paul Manafort, whom we've discussed in the 2 previous parts of this series, as well as this one right here entitled Out on a Ledger, where we do a deep dive into Paul Manafort, his real estate dealings with the Vatican, as well as his knowledge of other dealings with the Vatican. He and Rick Gates were indicted in 2017 on numerous charges for his consulting work for Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine. And this came by way of Robert Mueller's special counsel. He was also subject of FISA warrants, and yet we have heard nothing from Paul Manafort. Now, if you'll remember, it was a ledger that brought him down. And here I am discussing it in this video. Check it out. Probably all true. This guy is a lifelong knucklehead. He has pleaded not guilty to all charges. But Manafort's role in Mueller's broader narrative remains carefully guarded and unknown to the public. And that is a very telling line, and this is sort of illustrating the point that I really want to show. Paul Manafort, ladies and gentlemen, I don't really think was any kind of good guy. This guy is a lifelong knucklehead that was essentially willing to make tons and tons of money off of whomever. Now, he probably has some personal politics, and I'm sure that he'd love to influence that along the way. But the fact of the matter is, whether it was foreign or domestic money, he didn't care. He was in on it. He was all about Paul Manafort. However, I'm not necessarily sure that I'm ready to lump Manafort into the pedophile aspect of all this, because that's where this story gets really curious. Why did Paul Manafort join the Trump campaign? Was he really trying to bring it down? And if so, why is he sitting there in prison? And if he really is an asset, why is he not dead? Because I think we all know how that happens, right? So it's really hard to know. And I think that what makes Paul Manafort's role in all this so curious is the fact that he's simply just put away. But that line's very telling. But Manafort's role in Mueller's broader narrative remains carefully guarded and unknown to the public. And his personal corruption is less significant, ultimately, than his lifetime role as a corrupter of the American system, which it looks like in a lot of ways he was. That he would be accused of helping a foreign power subvert American democracy is a fitting coda to his life's story. So I'm going to be quite honest with you. That's a very long article, and we could go way into Paul Manafort because, quite honestly, it is sort of one of those legend-type stories. He's been around for a really long time, and I guess that's really what I want to establish, at least at this point in the video. Paul Manafort was a big-time fixture, and he had a lot of power, and he knew a lot of people, and a lot of people were very influenced by him, which means that he was influential. This was a smart person. This is a person that knows how to talk to people. This is a person with incredible social skills. And from what it seems, he was probably, like President Trump, an obsessive note taker. And a person who knows all these people and wields all this power usually holds a ton of information, and it's likely stored on all kinds of pieces of paper. Remember, this guy had these papers stored in his safe. He had tens of millions of dollars stashed in different locations. This guy was not a dummy. He's been doing it for decades. He has lots of information on lots of different people. Now, we do know that the story is that this ledger was what took him away, but we also know that the source of that ledger now has proven to be a little bit faulty. We know that that was a lie about their support for Hillary Clinton and Trump. We do know that they were supporting Hillary. So it calls into the question the ledger again. But let's also consider the classic tactic used by these deep state knuckleheads. And I don't want to call them black hats, but we'll call them deep state knuckleheads. Projection. So that means if they're going to get Paul Manafort for a ledger, does that mean that Paul Manafort has ledgers on them? Rudy Giuliani wants to know. And so do I. So there's a bit about Paul Manafort for now. He is a key figure in all of this, and yet, like I keep saying, no one seems to be hearing anything from him. But if you will remember, at the time, he and his partner Rick Davis got together with a man named Raffaello Follieri, who ended up going to jail. In 2008, he pleaded guilty to wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy, and ended up spending 4 years in prison. He had also been famous for dating actress Anne Hathaway. You may remember this. There was also a little bit of a row when they saw Senator No Name You-Know-Who McCain on his boat at one time. This was Raffaello Follieri, and according to Follieri himself, they were buying off unused real estate that the Vatican was trying to offload to raise money to pay off costs for all their child sex scandals. And this is how he ended up becoming close with Doug Band, who was trying to facilitate a relationship between Hillary Clinton and Catholic voters at the time. He was even invited on stage at a Clinton Foundation event for a donation that he never ended up making. We go into this story in that video too, so please check it out. So it was Doug Band who facilitated this pledge by Follieri, $50 million by way of the Clinton Global Initiative, on the condition that another friend of Bill Clinton, who is billionaire Ron Burkle, would invest in the same venture. Now, Follieri never came up with the money, but Burkle did come up with $105 million, and that went to Follieri's church buying scheme. Through that, Band ended up getting a finder's fee of $400,000. Ronald Wayne Burkle is the co-founder and managing partner of Yucaipa Companies LLC, which is a private investment firm. And they own a ton of chains, including Whole Foods Market. Burkle is also a big-time Democrat fundraiser. And along with this land-buying scam involving Manafort and Davis and Follieri, Burkle was featured in Epstein's Black Book. Burkle is also a board member of the J. Paul Getty Trust. He donated $15 million to the Walt Disney Concert Hall, and he has a couple of nonprofits that he raises funds for, including Share Our Strength and its No Kid Hungry campaign. In January of 2020, Ron's son Andrew was found dead, 27 years old, at his Beverly Hills home, and that was a bit of a mystery as they found no cause of death. Now I want to add one more thing about Follieri. A big fan of his was one Tony Podesta, who, like Manafort, liked to do a lot of lobbying, especially in Ukraine. Tony Podesta, of course, the brother of Clinton ally John Podesta, who, like Doug Band, was trying to get involved with the Catholic Church. And now we can start to see why, because evidently there were some really lucrative land purchases to be made. And where there's signs of sexual abuse and human trafficking, you will find a Clinton connection. One more character related to Paul Manafort that I want to discuss is Romano Prodi, who was the former Prime Minister of Italy and President of the European Commission from 1999 to 2004. Prodi had been registered with the DOJ as lobbying for the European Center for a Modern Ukraine. And although he denied direct connections to Paul Manafort, he was accused of taking more than $2 million from Paul Manafort to promote Viktor Yanukovych. Members of European Parliament have been accusing him of being a KGB guy for many years, although it's never truly been proven. But in 1978, Prodi was accused of participating in the kidnapping of former Prime Minister Aldo Moro, and this was done by a militant group known as the Red Brigades. Following Moro's kidnapping, the Red Brigades executed him on May 9, 1978. Pope Paul VI would die shortly after that. The Red Brigades were also rumored to have been planning to kidnap Pope John Paul II, and in 1979 had also gone after Paul Marcinkus. But this was Romano Prodi, who is also a big-time economist and has been very instrumental in something even bigger nowadays, which is that of the China-Vatican Accord. This accord is a provisional agreement signed back in 2018 and has the potential to be extremely disastrous for the Chinese people. This allows China to nominate their bishops apart from the Vatican, which essentially allows them to make sure that all of these clergymen now become Chinese government officials. What it's led to is the shutting down of numerous parishes, electricity, water, supplies, all being cut off to these churches, and anybody involved with the church being either forced to convert to the party or be forced out on the street. This could potentially lead to another situation like we have seen with the Muslim Uyghurs out there in China. So you see how this has the potential to become a biblical issue. Along with these numerous sketchy real estate deals that appear to be involved with human trafficking or the funding of legal defense for sexual abuse allegations, we had another raid that occurred in early 2020 in February, where numerous documents and computer equipment were taken from the home of Bishop Alberto Perlasca, who is the former head of the administrative office of the first section of the Secretariat of State. And this was a part of this larger scope of investigation that's been going on into all these financial investments. Now, along with all these multi-million-dollar properties, particularly in downtown London, it appears that the Vatican had invested more than $1 million to finance the film Rocket Man, which is about the life of singer-songwriter Elton John. What's more is they were using money that was being donated by the Peters Pence collection. The Peters Pence collection is discussed in my Cardinal Sins Part 2 video, but this is a very old foundation set up to collect money from landowners and to be given to those who are suffering from some sort of global crisis. Instead, they decided to use it to fund a film about Elton John. Bravo. They had also given nearly $4 million to the 2019 production of Men in Black. So this was all money being taken from wealthy landowners to be given to people who are experiencing a global crisis, like a Hollywood film. Probably also just a coincidence that that film was brought to you by Paramount Pictures. Which leads us all up to now. Recently, Pope Francis appointed 6 women to oversee the Vatican finances, one of them being Ruth Kelly, the former labor minister, and also a known member of Opus Dei. All of these appointees are from Europe, and all of them have financial backgrounds. So there you have it. Will these Vatican raids lead to more exposure of not only the human trafficking issues, but the companies and the organizations that are connected with them, such as these Hollywood films and other slush funderies? Is this why Barr and Durham flew to Rome to listen to a secret tape of Joseph Mifsud, who is the professor at the center of the Mueller investigation, which indicted Paul Manafort? Is this why Rudy Giuliani would like to hear from Manafort? And is it possible that Trump's selection of Nessun Dorma and Hallelujah are both ironic and poignant at the same time? Well, as always, you decide. If you liked this video, please click like, share, and subscribe. If you'd like to support my channel, you can find me at Sir Patrick Mac on patreon.com, and you can help support more searches just like this. If you're watching me on YouTube, all my links are down below, or they are pinned to my Twitter. Thanks for watching. This is Sir Patrick Mac, and until next time, stay vigilant.